Do you ever feel like you could physically eat your own words? Because right now, I do. On Saturday, August 3rd, I was closely following the incident that happened in El Paso, Texas at a Walmart where a 21-year-old man by the name of Patrick Crucius went into the store and ended up claiming the lives of 22 people and injuring 24 more. Mass shootings happen all too often these days, but I'm not here to tell you where I stand on gun control or anything of that sort. But earlier this year, on Memorial Day, an EF1 tornado touched down outside of my hometown of Charles City, Iowa. You know, the backdrop of episode 1. But I thought to myself, this isn't going to happen here. This is Dayton. Then later that night, a total of 15 tornadoes hit the Dayton area, demolishing much of the city. So back to where I was starting this. On the night of August 3rd, I was following closely the El Paso shooting. And I had a few drinks at my bar, and I went home, went to bed. Mass shootings don't typically happen in Dayton. But that night, it did. On Sunday morning at 1:05 a.m., 24-year-old Connor Betts went to the very bar that Haley worked at and opened fire while Haley was working and claimed the lives of 9 people, then injuring 27 more in the ordeal. The police came and took him down, as well as a bartender that we all know. It was only 30 seconds that it took for this man to tear this very town to pieces. But I didn't know anything about it until I woke up the next morning to at least 100 different notifications asking if Haley and I were okay. Now, I was for sure, but when you wake up to an incident like this, nobody's ever really, okay. Haley was not hurt in the shooting, but emotionally and energetically, she was exhausted to every single extent. Our town had just become a political talking point and squarely in the public eye, which hasn't happened since, I think, maybe the John Crawford murder in 2014 at the Walmart in Beaver Creek. But I want to thank all of you who have reached out to us and took time out of your day and sent your condolences and concerns to us. If we didn't message you back, just know that we did see your message and we want to thank you regardless. But with the aftermath, the 9 people who were taken away from us were 27-year-old Lois Oglesby, 30-year-old Logan Turner, 25-year-old Nicholas Coomer, 25-year-old Thomas McNichols, 57-year-old Derek Fudge, 36-year-old Beatrice Warren Curtis, 39-year-old Monica Brickhouse, 38-year-old Saeed Salih, and 22-year-old Jordan Kofer, the brother of the shooter. All of this was for absolutely nothing. A senseless act of violence that brought my beloved town and one of the biggest melting pots of the town to its knees. We made the announcements that we were okay, but that was a month ago, and I'm here. I want to thank you for being here as well. But Haley has decided to leave Murder and Such. We made that announcement before the release of this episode, and I personally want to thank Haley with every ounce of my being for everything she brought to the show. The jokes that she had, the incredible stories that she told you and I. Haley has started her training to become an EMS to help people who need it, and I can't blame her for that. As she told me, it's one thing to talk about people dying, but it's another thing to watch people die. And I don't think you or I can fault her for that. So I ask of you to keep Haley in your thoughts and minds and wish her luck with her future endeavors and thank her for all of her contributions. Please don't forget to follow her on Instagram as haley.jay.horror, like horror movies. But Haley was crucial to this show. I've been doing this show for 2 years now. We had Brittany on, and then we had Haley on, and Haley saved the show. If it wasn't for Haley, we wouldn't have the fucking pickle moniker. But I made the decision that I'm going to keep the show going. It's going to be different from here on out. I personally had somebody ask a question to us, if we thought about doing more serious episodes. And I think that the first one I really buckled down on was the Capitol Hill Massacre, where I actually had an interview with our good friend Ashley Black, whose friend was the first victim. And that's something I want to do with this show. I will still have people on every once in a while, coming in, doing guest interviews, spots, even interviews set up with people who are related to the cases. And I hope that you'll join me on this. I can't really do a comedy show without another person, but we'll have serious ones and we will have funny ones. So, what happens with the show now? I'm going to continue doing it. For this episode, I will be solo. And I hate to say it, but this episode will have 2 parts to it, as I'm waiting to interview somebody who's involved in the case. I believe that these people, they have stories that need to be told, and whether I'm doing it with just you and I, or if I bring on one of my friends, I do hope that you will join me and let me fill your ear holes as I've done for 50 episodes now. So, as the moniker says, if this doesn't suit your tastes, you may want to find another podcast to listen to. But if this does interest you, I am Hunter, and I thank you for being with me today. And please enjoy this episode of Murder and Such. First of all, I want to thank you if you've made it this far. If this is your first episode, I thank you for being here. If this is your second, third, or 51st episode, thank you for being here as well. This show will be taking more of a serious tone when I go solo on these cases, but I hope that you enjoy them as you did before. To catch up, I do have our Patreon thank yous, as we used to call housekeeping. So I personally would like to thank Kate Poff for her donation. Another thank you to our friend Stacy Chapman up in Canada. A massive thank you to Thrasher Banks, and you should be listening to his podcast called Lords of Death. It is fucking amazing. If you're not listening to it, pause this, go subscribe to it right now. And last, but most definitely not least, a big thank you to our friend Stacy Jenks for jumping on the Patreon as well. If you would like to donate to the show and offset the costs of research, production, you can visit murderandsuch.com or patreon.com/murderandsuch. And the only tier I have is $1 per episode and only 2 episodes per month. Sometimes more, but those are always free. So I thank you to both the Stacys, and thank you to Kate, and thank you to Thrasher for being so generous. But we're going to take a small break and hear a trailer from our friend Olivia Lind and her new podcast called Flat Rock. Please subscribe to it and leave him a review on all of your podcast services. And I'll be back with the case in just a minute.
One time a detective says she never had a chance. What did he mean by that? What did they know that the public don't know?
In 1969, Kathy Jones was brutally murdered on her way to a Nashville skating rink. The public wasn't told about one of the strongest suspects in her case, and I want to know more. Join me for Flat Rock, a cold case podcast where I'll be taking a deep dive into Kathy's murder and bringing you with me.
Someone out there still alive today. Someone knows something.
So as we all know, I can get pretty political. I might take jabs here or there at politicians and whatnot, but something came up recently that I hadn't really seen for quite some time. A name. Now, I was watching C-SPAN and watching the testimony of Robert Mueller III, but when everything was said and done, this name kept popping up. And I knew this name, and I knew it was something that I had never really looked into, but it was just one of those things that rings a bell, even when you can't put your finger on the location of it. So what was the news? On July 25th of 2019, United States Attorney General William Barr had announced that he was going to resume the use of capital punishment by the United States of America. Essentially, federally mandated death penalty to offenders and murderers, essentially people who had killed children or the elderly. In most recent past, there have been 3 federal executions in the states before the time we had the death penalty taken off the table. The 3 who were killed by the government were, and this is not in order, Juan Raul Garza, executed on June 19th of 2001 for the murder of Thomas Albert Rumbo, and he had ordered the murders of 7 other people, but he was also known to be a part of a drug smuggling ring. The next person is Timothy McVeigh, who was killed 8 days prior, but of course, if you follow any true crime stuff, you know him by his moniker as the Oklahoma City Bomber for when he bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in 1995. I'll have you note that this was the first execution carried out since 1963, so that was over 40 years prior. But the last one to have been executed was Lewis Jones Jr., in which he was executed on March 18th of 2003 for the rape and murder of Private Tracy McBride in Texas. Since then, the federal death penalty was abolished, and a lot of the inmates still on federal death row could spend the rest of their lives in the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, until someone resurrected the death penalty once again. I'll also make note that the judge cannot overturn a death penalty charge when it is handed down by a jury in a federal case. Whether it's life in prison or execution, the charges will ultimately stick. Usually for charges related to drug trafficking on a grand scale, murdering or attempting to murder a member of Congress, judges, the president, also with treason, espionage, and other large-name crimes. They won't kill you for having weed on you or driving drunk, so you have to fuck up pretty bad. So why now, though? Why is the federal death penalty reinstated? President Donald Trump has always touted his, quote, tough on crime moniker since he was elected into office. Since we hadn't executed someone for nearly 20 years, William Barr decided that he was going to bring back the federal executions once again. Which, I will say that some people do deserve the death penalty. We've talked about that on the show, and I'll tell you a little bit of why. So if there's ever a sliver of doubt whether someone committed a crime, I think that there shouldn't be a death penalty. One person being wrongfully executed is one person too many. But it's going back to the whole tough on crime thing. Believe it or not, it actually costs taxpayers more to kill someone than to keep them alive. Now, according to Amnesty International, a conservative cost to execute somebody is $1,260,000 compared to it only costing $740,000 for someone to serve out a life sentence behind bars. A lot of people don't understand that. But when it comes to the administration, it's very much an eye for an eye thing. And I hate to say it, but it doesn't sound like the administration cares much for keeping the costs low and would rather execute them instead. Within the next 9 months, we're looking to spend $6.3 million on executing 5 people at the request of the federal government. There are currently 62 inmates on death row, and William Barr has picked 5 people to be executed within those months, all using lethal injection as the method. Now, those 5 inmates are Danny Lewis Lee, who was convicted in 1999 for the murders of a family back in 1996 as a shitty plot to start up his own form of segregation and make up his own, quote, whites-only nation. He and an accomplice killed a gun dealer named William Muller and his wife Nancy and her 8-year-old daughter. He will be executed on December 9th of this year. Now this one is a little more gruesome, but Alfred Bourgeois will be executed on January 13th of 2020 after he was convicted in 2004 for the torture, molestation, and the death of his 2.5-year-old daughter. That included hitting her with a baseball bat, beating and punching her in the face, hitting her with an electrical cord, a belt, and burning her feet with a lighter. So he's going to be executed. Now the third person is Wesley Ira Perkey. He was convicted of the rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl before completely dismembering her body and dumping it in a septic pond. and then also attacking and killing an 80-year-old woman with a claw hammer in Kansas. He is scheduled to be executed on December 13th of 2019. Next is Lesmond Mitchell, who stabbed a 63-year-old woman to death in 2003 and then forced her 9-year-old granddaughter to sit beside her corpse in a vehicle for a 40-mile trek before he slit her throat, beheaded the both of them, and left their bodies in a shallow grave. He will be put to death on December 11th of this year. Now, the last person. This is where my wheels started turning, and I knew it was something from way back. Even before I moved to Dayton, that one fucking name that when I heard it, it made a hairs on my neck stand up. So, if you're ready to get into this, this is episode 51, Dustin Lee Honken. For this episode, yes, we're heading back to Iowa. Only about a half hour from where I grew up and where episode 1 took place, the town of Mason City, Iowa. But this happened much earlier when I remembered that I had an interest in true crime. This happened back in the early 90s, and at the time of the incident, so I would have only been about 5 to 6 years old. So I was probably watching Nickelodeon or playing Nintendo and, as a kid does, just not being super invested in the news. Mason City definitely has some history to it, even when it comes to true crime. I know that True Crime Garage did a 2-part episode about the disappearance of Jody Huisentruit, which wasn't a bad job by them, but they left out a lot of key information and the current status of the investigation. But then again, I'm biased considering I do remember when she went missing on June 27th of 1995, then legally declared deceased in May of 2001. So that case definitely hits pretty close to home. Another little fun tidbit about Mason City is that on March 13th of 1934, a dark blue Buick sedan had pulled up and outran Eddie Green, Red Hamilton, Tommy Carroll, Homer Van Meter, Joseph Burns, Babyface Nelson, and none other than John motherfucking Dillinger. They came in and managed to steal $52,000, which is $933,987 in today's money. But they stole that from the bank and got the fuck out of Dodge. So like I said, Mason City has some definite history to it when it comes to the macabre. The last time there was an execution in Iowa was in 1963 when a man had lured a doctor across the Mississippi River into Illinois and then killed him. The man was executed by hanging, and Iowa repealed the death penalty 2 years later in 1965. But let's back up. Dustin Lee Honken. That was just one of those lingering names that you'd hear float around every now and again, but you can't quite put your finger on it or remember what it was in reference to. But Mason City is the largest city in Cerro Gordo County. It's home to almost 30,000 people based on the 2018 estimates, which makes it the 16th largest city in all of Iowa. It's roughly 28 square miles of land, and I even lived there for a few years. It's kind of cute, kind of quaint, and I still have a lot of very close friends who live in the area, so shout out to all my friends back home. Now, another thing I talk about quite a bit is talking about how Iowa has a drug problem. In 2004, Iowa was known as the meth capital of the country. Hell, there's even a book named Methland, The Death and Life of a Small Town by Nick Redding that's based around my father's hometown of Olwine, Iowa. From an article I found in the Des Moines Register, there was a big surge in the 90s that went all the way up to 2007, but then declined heavily in 2008. But now, it's bigger than ever. It said that there were more patients who want to seek treatment for methamphetamine, which is always a good thing, but the meth usage continues to surge back in my home state. But this case takes place well before Breaking Bad started, and well before the decline in 2008. This is going to take me back to some of the earliest starting points that I could find. So Dustin Lee Honken was born on March 22nd of 1968, and I can't find exactly where he was born, but it also said that he traveled in and around the Southwest quite a bit and was also known to be incredibly intelligent. He had a brother that I could find, and he had attended a community college when he lived in Tempe, Arizona. His main course that he was interested in, though? Chemistry. You see, this was something that was still kind of new back then. Meth. Meth had always kind of been around, but typically you'd have people making old school biker meth with jugs back then, not someone who's a chemistry major attempting to make it. So kind of think of this dude back in 1992 as like Iowa's own little Walter White back then. Maybe not as smart as the almighty Heisenberg, but he definitely knew his chops and he could cook. He went about doing this with his brother and a childhood friend, but he had managed to sell several pounds to a guy in Iowa named Terry DeGuess and another guy named Greg Nicholson. Now, apparently the product had been so good that Dustin had decided that the market value was rich enough for him to move to Iowa and start manufacturing his product there. Considering, he was cutting out the middleman for transportation costs, and it was actually fetching him a higher price. However, considering it was a higher quality product, he wanted to keep his inner circle very, very small and only worked with Terry and Greg. The less people holding his product and the less people getting his money would mean that there's less people to pay, less of a chance of somebody getting nailed by the police, and of course, less people even knowing that he exists. So from there, he lived in the town of Britt. Britt is about 30 miles west of Mason City, and the towns of Garner and Clear Lake are in between. Clear Lake, Iowa also has some history to it, as the Surf Ballroom is located in the city. It was the last place that Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper played their last show on February 2nd of 1959 before their plane had crashed in the early hours of the following day when they encountered a severe snowstorm. This has been known in history as, quote, the day the music died. So, there you go. There's some more Iowa stuff than, just Slipknot. So with him exclusively working with Greg Nicholson and Terry DeGuess, he had contacted Mason City native Timothy Cutcomp to help him cook. Think of Timothy as kind of your little Jesse Pinkman, but less cool, because Iowa. When working with Terry, he met Terry's then-girlfriend named Angela Johnson in 1993. From there, it's been reported that Terry and Angela had broken off their relationship, and then Angela started dating Dustin himself, in which later in the year, Angela had found herself pregnant with Dustin's first baby. But from here, we are going to back up a little bit. In March of 1993, the Cerro Gordo County Sheriff's Department, along with the Mason City Police Department, Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations, and even the FBI had obtained a search warrant and had searched the house of Greg Nicholson for drug trafficking. Considering they had sufficient evidence to find Greg pretty much dead to rights on everything and anything related to the local drug enterprise. So, considering this information, the police end up working a deal with Greg to get him to cooperate with the authorities and the FBI on who was running this entire deal, since Greg himself was just a low-level dealer. So they set up a meeting and have Greg wear a wire, and the meeting was to happen on March 21st of 1993. During the meeting, Dustin and Greg talked about the current running operation, and Greg had even paid Dustin $3,000 cash for past deliveries that took place. All the while, Dustin had no earthly idea that his very, very small circle of friends that he thought he could actually trust had actually planned out to be his downfall. So that same day, Dustin and Timothy are arrested in Mason City on conspiracy to manufacture, distribute, and the trafficking of methamphetamine charges stemming from an internal investigation, and are held without bond at the Cerro Gordo County Jail. They had found information for 2 men to be federally charged, and that was carried out on March 26th of 1993 for the same charges, but also running a drug enterprise both in Arizona and Iowa, respectively. Now, these were federal charges, which are pretty hardcore considering the federal government always supersedes the state government. So they waited for April 20th of 93 as he stood in front of the testimony of Greg Nicholson and had a federal grand jury had decided to indict Dustin for conspiracy to manufacture methamphetamine, and the state charges were dropped altogether. Dustin had declared that he was going to plead guilty to the charges as they had him dead to rights, and that was scheduled for July 30th of 1993. So what happened? All this evidence against him, Greg Nicholson's testimony, and compliance with the feds for a little drug empire that they were running just seems to be pretty open and shut case, right? In July of that year, a mutual friend of Greg Nicholson had introduced him to 32-year-old woman by the name of Lori Duncan, and they hit it off pretty well. Lori was a single mother and maybe looking for someone to keep her company. I'll tell you one thing, that pretty much everyone in Iowa knows each other, so it's kind of cool that they hit it off so well. Lori had 2 little girls by the name of Candace, who is 10, and Amber, who is 6. And it wasn't very long after that Greg had met Lori that he actually took up Lori's offer and he started staying at Lori's house with her and her girls. And trust me, there's a reason to why he did this. So earlier in July, Dustin and Timothy were released on bond, but Dustin was out for blood. He wasn't going to be facing 10 years or more for his manufacturing charges, so he and Angela started scouring the area looking for Greg, and he wasn't going to let this guy get away with it. Considering that Dustin was facing criminal charges from the FBI, he had Angela file an application to buy a handgun on July 3rd. Considering the size of Mason City, Greg could have been anywhere. If I were him, I wouldn't have disclosed to anyone that I wasn't directly around where I was located at. You've got a guy and a woman who are looking for you, and of course, they are not happy with what you had just done to them. I can't even find any information about Greg trying to be protected from Dustin and Angela trying to find him. This would have been an incident that the police department would surely regret. On Wednesday, July 7th of 1993, Dustin and Angela had their friend by the name of Christy Gobats watch Angela's child as they hopped in their car with fire in their veins and head to the central town of Waterloo, Iowa. Now, Waterloo, Iowa is a pretty hefty trek when it comes to the distance from Mason City, or at least it always seemed that way when I was living in the state. To get to Waterloo, you would need to take the Avenue of the Saints southeast out of town, go past the town of Charles City, and go further south to the town of Waterloo. Now, Waterloo is somewhat famous for the Sullivan brothers, which back in World War II, 5 brothers were stationed on the USS Juneau together during World War II, until all 5 brothers were killed in duty on or around November 13th of 1942. There's even a song called Sullivan by the band Caroline Spine, which was popular back in 1997 off of their album Monsoon. And I'm actually kind of a big fan of that song, and it reminds me of home. But either way, the trip itself is about 80 miles from Mason City, and this is roughly about an hour-and-a-half long trip as well, but I couldn't find exactly which pawn shop they had gone into, so I can't pinpoint how long the journey actually took. Either way, there's one thing that I do know for sure. When they were in Waterloo, Angela brought with her permit to purchase a handgun and ended up picking up a Tech 9 from the shop. A Tech 9 is a 9mm handgun which was produced from 1985 until 2001 and has the capabilities to be fitted with a 10, 20, 32, 36, 50, and 72 round magazines that were manufactured for it. It's not commonly found today, but it's somewhat of a notorious gun as it's easily concealable and can have a very large capacity magazine. Needless to say, Angela and Dustin were taking their hunt for Greg very seriously. They headed back to Mason City with gun in tow and continued their search for the next weeks, trying to find Greg Nicholson. Many days were spent scouring the area, trying to get an idea of where he could be. Greg stopped going to his usual bars and started shopping at different areas that he thought Dustin and Angela might recognize him at. And it should be said that Timothy Cutcomp started conversing with Dustin at this time as he was facing the same charges as he was, and he came out later saying that he could tell that something had changed in Dustin and he wasn't going to let Greg out of this alive. Now that brings us to July 24th of 1993. Dustin and Angela had found some information to the whereabouts of Greg and asked Christy to watch Angela's child once again. This was growing ever closer to the 30th of July when both Greg and Dustin were scheduled to appear in federal court and defend themselves for the drug charges. According to later testimony and published by the Globe-Gazette in Mason City and the Sioux City Journal in Sioux City, Iowa, Dustin and Angela had parked their car a few blocks away from Lori Duncan's house. They brought with a duffel bag, rope, the Tech-9 fashioned with a silencer, a video camera, and the worst intentions that one could possibly think of. Here is your trigger warning. This is about to get very intense. This also does involve children. You have been warned. When they approached the house, Angela knocked on the door, and it was stated that she posed as a cosmetic saleswoman who had found herself lost in the neighborhood. When Lori opened the door, Angela could see in the house and found Greg and Lori's 2 daughters sitting inside the living room. Asking if she could use the phone, Lori had let her in, but soon behind her was Dustin. Dustin and Angela both ordered the family into different rooms. Dustin took Greg into one room as Angela grabbed Lori, Candace, and Amber and took them into a different room. As Dustin had Greg at point-blank range, he took out the video camera and proceeded to force Greg to record himself denying that Dustin had any involvement with the meth manufacturing and that he lied to the authorities. Essentially, complete exoneration of all crimes. Meanwhile, you could hear the girls crying from the other room, and Angela went to town, tying up Lori and her daughters. She used an electrical cord to bind their arms behind their backs and used t-shirts to gag the girls and muffle their screams. When Dustin was alone with Greg, he proceeded to tie him up and gag him, much like Angela did with the girls. Then he proceeded to pistol whip him in the head and scream at him while he tried to beg for his life. From there, he grabbed Greg and dragged him into the same bedroom as Lori and Angela and her 2 daughters. From there, he proceeded to take out his rage and start strangling Greg as the other 3 girls watched him. During this time, Dustin started getting enraged with the screaming, so he gave his gun to Angela and she hit Lori in the head with the gun multiple times, knocking her unconscious while Greg was strangled to death. Dustin then proceeded to grab an electrical cord and also strangle 32-year-old Lori Duncan until she also died. After that is when this gets even darker. With both Greg and Lori dead, Dustin sets his attention on 10-year-old Amber and 6-year-old Candace and proceeds to strangle the girls until they also pass. It came out later that Dustin said that he had killed them because, quote, they wouldn't shut up or be quiet. He also stated that, quote, they were rats being raised by rats. Either way, this man and his girlfriend had just eliminated an entire family just to stay out of prison. It was said that in later sentencing that Lori Duncan's father felt guilty about the incident because he wanted to have the girls stay with him that night, but at the time it was not convenient for him. From there, Angela went back outside and grabbed the car and pulled it up to the back of the house. Angela and Dustin then proceeded to grab all 4 bodies and place them in the trunk and the back seats of the car, then headed south out of town. While there, they brought with the Tech-9 with a silencer attached and pulled each body out of the car one by one. Dustin then proceeded to point the barrel of the gun at each of the 4 victims and shoot them multiple times as to ensure that they were dead. They then grabbed a shovel where they dug shallow graves and placed Greg, Lori, and the 2 girls inside, covered the remains, and headed back into the Mason City limits. Now, As I stated earlier in this episode, the reason why William Barr wanted to execute these 5 people is due to the nature of their crimes. He wanted to execute the ones who had been convicted of preying on the most defenseless of humans, children and the elderly. For these 2 girls to watch their own mother and her boyfriend die takes a certain type of monster, one with absolutely no moral compass, a complete disregard for human life, and someone that is truly a special shade of fucked up. It's even more disgusting when you also realize that Angela Johnson co-signed this vicious quadruple murder, and she also had a child at the time. I can't even imagine. It's also worth noting that when Dustin and Angela had usually went out looking for Greg, they had come back at around midnight or somewhere around there. But this night was different. They had returned back home at around 5 o'clock in the morning on July 5th of 1993. Now, Christy Gobats could tell something was up because this was definitely out of the norm. And the next day, on July 26th of 1993, is when Greg, Lori, Candace, and Amber were all reported missing, with no trace to be found. So what happened from here? There's a court date approaching, and their key witness is missing. Does the prosecution have anything to go off of? Is there any evidence that they left behind that could link them to the disappearances and subsequent murders? This is where I will be ending part 1 of the Dustin Lee Honken case. Please stay tuned for part 2, as I may have an interview with the key witness in this case. But I do thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you stick around for things to come. If you would like to follow the show, you can find links to all of our social media at murderandsuch.com, or you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at murderandsuch. If you would like to follow me personally, you can find me on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and the PlayStation Network at Huntor27. If you would like to help support the show and help with the production and research costs, you can find our Patreon page at patreon.com/murderandsuch, and we only have the 1 tier. It's $1 per episode and only 2 episodes per month. You can also find that on murderandsuch.com. I would also like to apologize for this episode and my voice, as I'm still getting over bronchitis, so I may sound a little different in the next episode, but if you would like to honestly just do me a solid favor. It sounds kind of off, but Haley told me the last time that I talked to her that we don't know how much time we have left on this earth, and she's completely right. So please, if you would, call somebody today and let them know that you care about them. Even hug a friend, embrace someone with your words and thoughts. You won't regret it. But that's all I've got for this one. So, until then, thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.